All right, so it looks like this stream will work better than the other one. So I had a question to start with from Matt. I'm not sure if, Matt, you're still around, but otherwise, when you'll tune in, you'll have an answer to the question. So the question was, Dan, I have an interview with Amazon next week. I was expecting the interview to be behavioral, but just received an email saying that it will be a competency-based interview. What's the difference? So in short, basically speaking, there is very little difference between the two. The theory is that a behavioral question is one that touches, I mean, they both start with tell me about the time, or both ask for your past experiences. The difference is that the behavioral one is more on the personality, more on the culture fit side, and while the situational one, the competency-based one, will be more like looking for competencies. So, for example, in the behavioral one could ask you, tell me about the time when you had to apologize to someone. So basically, I have here an example. Let me look. Yeah, give me an example of a time when you didn't meet a goal and how you handled this. This would be the behavioral part, and basically, there's no right or wrong answer here. Well, so they say, but there is more on the cultural side. Whereas the other one, the competency-based interviews, they are looking at the specific competency. Tell me about the time when you supported a colleague who was struggling with an area of work. So that one was more about the core competency of teamwork. So they want to see whether you're a team player. However, from experience, there's not much difference between competency and behavioral questions. So my experience has shown that you should prepare them in the same way. So just let me paste the original question that was posted there. Yeah, it is. So this was the question that I just answered. What's the difference? So basically, there's not much of a difference. So what matters here with these behavioral questions is that you properly prepare what are the most commonly asked ones, and you prepare proper star stories. So they both get answered in the same way. Also worthwhile noting here is the definition of these questions. I mean, why someone would ask you questions about your past behavior is that they want to predict your future performance on the job. So one thing to keep in mind is the more recent your experiences, the better they will sound, the better the ability for your interviewer to properly assess your competencies, if you want, or your behavioral interviewing skills. So there you go. This is the main difference, and basically there's no difference. There's not a lot of a difference. Something else that you may want to be interested in here is that I remember that I had a candidate who also sent me a list with some core competencies that might be testing during the job interview, but I don't know which what type of role are we talking here. So, for example, for a product manager role, they could test you on product value and pricing, or data-driven decision making and metrics, roadmap prioritization and trade-offs, project and stakeholder management, detailed product definition, and tech depth in this case in robotics. So and also simulation and industry knowledge in robotics. But as you can see here, there's a mix between there's a mix, usually from these behavioral questions between this behavioral side, and they could easily get into the technical side. And this is, the trick that for the behavioral side, you must prepare as many scenarios as you can and with quality answers, and then be prepared to dive deeper into more details there with the more relevant metrics and essentially what you think is the bread and butter of that example. And of course, be prepared to deprobe your expertise within that specific situation. All right. So I think I've covered enough this topic. So let me go to the next one. So what if you don't have enough stories for entry level regarding the on-site interview, I would assume. So can I use the same story which applies to different leadership principles? So let's make some things clear at first. So junior roles don't have to prepare all leadership principles for the Amazon on-site interview, and more often than not, you should find this which of the leadership principles they are more interested in from your main point of contact. For example, software development engineers have only 4 leadership principles usually. Now, can you use the same story for multiple examples? Of course you can, and even senior roles do, and many successful candidates use the same stories. The difference is they don't use the precise same story for any given example. They don't make the conversation sound like, as I just mentioned in the previous example, in the same project we did the same thing, and that would also showcase this, the answer to your question. So what you must ensure here is that you have some, like for senior roles, I usually recommend 15 to 20 stories, different ones, because basically you would prepare 2 times 14 principles, 28, and because there's some overlap, you'll end up with 15 to 20 stories. But for junior roles, I understand it's not feasible to talk about these numbers, so probably want to be within the 5 to 10 stories. And those 5 to 10 stories should be laser focused to the principles that you're preparing for and the questions that are most likely going to get asked for those principles. And if you do that, basically cover many of the possible scenarios in this case. And maybe to test your knowledge here, regardless of which leadership principles make the most sense, try to find my list with the 35 most commonly asked questions. It's here on YouTube, and try to answer as many of those questions and see how often will you use the same story over and over again. So if you manage to get a good amount of stories with different a good amount of answers with different stories, then I would say you should be good to go there. So try with that list with the 35 most commonly asked questions. Another strategy here would be to use the same story, but don't call the project the same project again. Just say, while working on this project, I did this. And then when you reference again the project, while I was working on the project, I was tasked to do this. And it would be a separate part of that project. Either it would be a separate part, other it would be you would zoom out of the situation and you would get a broader example. But the zooming out and zooming in and referencing different parts of the project could work to say different examples. So this is how you ensure diversity, if you want, in your example, especially for entry-level roles. So I think I answered this one. So I have an on-site interview coming up with Amazon. From my understanding, there will be 4 interviews, with only one of them being technical interview. What should I expect from the other 3? Behavioral questions. And yeah. And also, what role are we talking about here? I would assume it's some sort of IT role. And is it a senior role? Is the junior? Usually, when they don't reference what the other 3 will be, they're going to be most likely behavioral to some extent. But I'm also wondering what do you mean by technical here, because they usually get more specific. So usually they should be behavioral. So the follow-up question, it's an apprenticeship role with AWS. I would expect that role to have a bit more of technical emphasis than behavioral. So I would be surprised if only one of those 4 sessions would be actually technical. So I would expect them to be a lot more a mix between the two. However, given the fact that it's an apprenticeship role, I would very much take a good look at the principles, and especially at their description, to understand what behaviors are involved there. One common mistake that I notice people tend to make is that they reference the name of the principles too much. So they always say, I'm customer obsessed, I have a lot of ownership, I always dive deep, and so my recommendation would be to be very careful how you pitch those principles, and because they mainly want to see whether you can do the job there, and secondary, if you are good with the principles. So apart from the leadership principles and STAR, what else should I focus on? As I've seen all your videos, even ones with bezels and 14 principles. So first of all, the most common mistake people tend to do with behavioral interviews is that they consume a lot of content, but they don't practice enough. So when preparing for a behavioral interview, 50% of it is practice, like at least 50% in many cases. So watching all my videos, I mean, thank you for watching my videos, of course, but it's at most 25% of these things, because the other 25% would be spent to draft your stories, and then the other 50% would be spent to role play. And in fact, one of the main reasons why I decided to enter in these live streams would be to clarify as many questions as possible that if I would have otherwise get asked by email or by other means, because I don't see these as the main thing preparing for a job interview. The main thing is to role play these things. That's where you get the most benefit. So I'm trying to somewhat accelerate your preparation here by answering the most commonly asked ones through this live stream, so you can move on with these things. Yeah. What is the safe way on answering questions? Describe a time when you failed. Describe a situation where you failed. So I believe the way you ask this question tells me that you don't understand how the question is. What's the purpose of this question? So the purpose of the question is to find the proper failure and a proper failure, and then the second most important thing here is to talk about what you learned from it. Now, of course, you could to a certain extent disqualify yourself if you're applying for for a project manager role, and you talk how you got fired from your last job 2 weeks ago because you failed to deliver a project. Yes, that wouldn't be the best example, but from experience, this does not happen. It only happened like maybe 3% of the time that people would talk about an example that would be a disqualifier. What happens here with the failure story is that people would either lie, pure and simply lie about the failure. They would just invent something. Either talk about the failure that had no impact. It wouldn't be a relevant one. So how do you know failure had an impact? Well, if it's quantifiable. So if you delay the project that was supposed to take 2 weeks to 3 weeks, then yes, that's a failure. It's a quantifiable failure, especially if you could also quantify it otherwise, that you had to spend more money on this project. And then, of course, the learnings. The learnings are super important in failure stories, because no matter how good your failure story is, if you don't have your learnings from it, it will be scored very poorly, both for the phone interview and for the on-site interview. Now, what I recommend people to do when answering this failure story is to use 1 or 2 sentences for the situation, 2 or 3 sentences for the action, 3 or more sentences for the learnings. Notice 2 things here. I didn't mention the task because I don't see the task as being a highlight in that STAR format. I think it's an overcomplication. And the second thing, I said 3 or more learnings from that failure situation. Why 3 or more? Because that's the main highlight. That's the most interesting part for the interviewer in that interview, aside from being a proper failure. And one thing you should, I could talk for hours about these things, but one more thing you should keep in mind about failure stories is that end it on a positive note. never ended, so I failed, and I'm sorry for that. Try to end it on a positive note. Yeah, so I can confirm what Stanimir says, that speaking from personal experience, prepare well your stories and be ready to defend them in follow-up questions. Yes, definitely. I can definitely confirm this, that this is the best possible thing to do, to prepare your stories and to role play them. Very important to role play them. Can you use situations in personal life as examples for behavioral questions? That would be a last resort thing you'd want to do. Why is this? The behavioral questions are designed in such a way that anyone could have an answer for them. The challenge is how quickly can you come up with the best possible answer. The best possible answer are recent ones and are quantifiable ones, and that really sound good. The second best ones are maybe not as recent, but still from your professional experience. So I should have said recent from your professional experience, but the second best ones are, maybe a bit older, earlier in your career, but still from your professional experience. And then, if you really cannot find anything, just as a last resort method, yes, you could go with one from personal experience. Again, my professional experience has shown that if you are serious about these things and if you prepare them for a few days, you will come up with answers for pretty much any behavioral questions. It's not as complicated as it might look in the beginning. All right. So it looks like I covered everything we had here. Sure. What do you mean by, now question to you, no after the interview, does it mean the door is closed? Well, if they tell you so hold on a second. If they refuse you for the on-site interview, and they don't tell you that you have to wait 1 year, you could reapply as soon as you find something interesting. If they tell you cannot reapply for 6 months or 1 year, it means you did something really wrong during the on-site interview. So that's at least my experience, and it's not uncommon for people to receive a call back after 3 months to ask them to reapply for a different role or even for the same role. So I had people who actually got hired the second time that they applied. They were invited. They got rejected, and they called back after they got the call back after 3 months to reapply, and they got the job. So a simple no, it means more like a yes, you can, so long as you can find something interesting. Is it wise to pick a story from distant past for failure stories? I wouldn't say it's the wisest way to go, because you should find a balance between a proper failure and a recent one. So probably you wouldn't want to use, a career damaging explanation here, but I wouldn't use a scenario such as, early in my career I used to fail because I was new to the job. So if you have 15 experience, when you were just getting started, I used to fail because of this. That's not a wise thing to do, because one would favorite follow-up questions. Okay, do you have a more recent one? So this is how they would get you there. And one of the main things with the failure story is that it must show how you grew from that story. And if you have a story of failure 15 years ago, okay, you could have grown from that one, but it's a less of an indicator of your performance on the job recently. I got a call for a second phone interview, but haven't heard from them since. Is it okay to send a follow-up email? If you haven't heard from them for more than 2 weeks, I would say so, but they usually get back to you sooner or later. But if I would say 2 weeks would be the threshold for me, at least. How should I answer a question such as describe a time where I did not get along with a coworker? So why would anyone ask you such a question? Because they want to see how well are your interpersonal skills. And this one would be on the leadership principle of earn trust, more likely. Because the point here, when you do not get along with someone, you should basically open communication and start listening to other person in order to win their trust. So this would be how you would go about such a story. First of all, you should find such an occurrence from a professional experience, of course, and try to think how you went about it. One mistake I remember people tend to do here is that they ended on a negative note. Like, for example, I didn't get along with the guy that was reporting to me, and I did everything I could, and there in the end, the result, they say, okay, and after 18 months, they left the company because we couldn't get along. So you wouldn't want to get into such scenarios, because unless you're asked for a failure story or a negative story, you should talk about, you should focus on your strengths, on your successes. So again, to recap a bit here, so the number one thing would be to understand why they ask you this question. It's about earn trust, about interpersonal skills. And the second thing is make sure that you end it on a positive note. So I have an interview with Amazon tomorrow with an Excel test. Any last minute tips? No, I only handle the behavioral part. Oh, it's only been 2 days until that phone call. No, you should definitely wait for at least 2 weeks. Like, yeah, be patient. So do you have any stats ratio of people clearing phone interview and failing the loop? If yes, what are the most common reasons? I mean, how could I possibly have statistics? I don't have statistics, and I'm really not following things in the way you're thinking. What are the most common reasons? People not, I mean, the most common reason why anyone would fail an interview, because they're not fit for that role. They're not technically fit. You don't know your thing for that role. I would say that the failures for behavioral reasons are quite often. So if you don't, especially in the case of Amazon, if you don't read the principles, you seriously decrease your chances of landing a job there. But the number one thing would be you're not good at what you're doing. That's the number one common reason. Also, people tend to make up stories quite often for these things. But yeah, I mean, if you cannot communicate, so if you're not good at behavioral interviewing, chances are someone else will. And since the competition is so high, this will be a disqualifier. I have a story I could use for the coworker. We just had a personality clash, but I was still professional enough so that we could work together. Yeah, so I think definitely it could work. Just ensure that it would end on a positive note. So I'm having an interview for in-stock manager. Anything you would suggest? Any tips to crack the? Are you talking about a phone interview here or on-site interview? If you're talking about the phone interview, take a look at the list with the 35 most commonly asked questions. Try to answer them. If you're having the on-site interview, look at the leadership principles and associated questions, and do your best to answer questions for each of them. So this would be how you would go about it. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. and role play them, of course. So I just got rejected after the on-site at Amazon. The feedback they gave me was that I lacked customer obsession on my answers. However, I'm a graduate and I have no experience with clients. Well, the fact that you're a graduate doesn't excuse the fact that you're not customer oriented. And in fact, I did notice while role playing with people that you would say you're customer oriented or customer obsessed, but in fact you would only be customer oriented here. And for instance, you would have a situation where something crashed in a software application and you fixed it, you identified the problem and fixed it for the client. Well, this would be a classic example of a time when you showed customer orientation, not obsession. That's why it's called customer obsession and not customer orientation. So especially for the case of graduates, you should identify your primary customer. One very common mistake people do, they don't understand what's their primary customer. So the primary customer is the one that you're working with for a project. It could be that you work in a company that allows direct contact with their end customer, but more often than not, your primary customer is your manager. So you should think it this way. Or in the case of graduates, think about your projects, your most significant projects that you had during school, and use those in this context. So I'm having an Amazon interview in 3 hours. This role requires some SQL experience. The hiring manager said there will be no technical interview, so the loop will not have a SQL questions. I cannot guarantee you this. You could expect some SQL questions, but I guess there's not much you can do in 3 hours. So I'm not sure there's something you can control to this. Do you know what is the structure of the second phone interview? My first round was behavioral and about my past work experience. Marketing manager. What will this be a behavioral round too? You cannot predict these things because the way you design a behavioral interviewing process, it would be different from role to role. So they design what questions to ask in what order for any candidates in advance. And for some, for marketing experience, I would definitely expect them to still grill you a little bit with behavioral questions, because otherwise, what could they ask you? But the proportion in which they would ask you behavioral question and more like marketing questions, if I may call them so, that's something you cannot really estimate in advance. And I don't think they know either in advance the percentage, the accent that they're going to put one way or another, because what happens is they will have some leadership principles they would have to scan you for here. And if they do not receive the answers they're looking for, they might be spending the bulk of their time asking you behavioral questions about those principles and less on the marketing. If the emphasis they choose to put on here would be on your subject matter expertise, then they would start with these types of questions, and then the behavioral questions would be secondary. Either case, I wouldn't be too worried about these things. So just try to refresh your memory with the main highlights in your career. And for the phone interviews, I found it useful that you maybe have a list with some notes about the more interesting answers. Like I'll have to reference again, but for example, keeping some bullet points on the list with the 35 most commonly asked questions could as well help you to go smoother through these types of questions. And also maybe also print out the leadership principles, just so you have them nearby. When asked about weaknesses, Can you please provide an example with a positive spin? I'm interviewing for a sales role. Sure. So usually salespeople choose to go with technical expertise as their weakness. So whenever you'd have a deep technical issue, you would call in your technical team to get it solved. So this way you show as a team player, and at the same time you're not you're you're not putting yourself in danger, because technical expertise, I would assume, is not core thing for that role. Is it okay to describe the same case for different questions but from different angles? Okay, so that one was retracted, it seems. What is a common good way to make myself stand out during an interview, and what would it be a bad idea to take some notes into an on-site interview? So what's a good way to stand out? Oh, to prepare, obviously. And would it be a bad idea to take some notes? Well, you will have to ask them a few questions towards the end of the interview. So if you take some notes there, I think it can only be beneficial. But other than that, I don't see why you would want to take notes. What is the questions usually they will ask for the position of public sector solution architect? There's no questions they usually ask public sector solution architects. Can I use the same story that I used at the first round? To a certain extent, yes, but try not to reference those stories by the same name, to make it look like exactly the same example. So the same story could be told in many different ways. So I would rather nuance it to sound a bit different, although it may be part of the same project. The reason being that they will take many notes, and if they say, like, when they gather their notes and they say, hey, this person talked about this story 3 times, that won't be helpful for you, because you won't show us having enough experience about these things. So I have an on-site interview with Amazon for an applied scientist role. I am preparing behavioral questions and I have trouble finding situations I can talk about to show my fit for the leadership principle. In my PhD, most of my interactions have been with my advisor, so I didn't really have any customer or team. Few colleagues, but I interact mostly with my advisor. Your advisor is your customer in this case. So yeah, your advisor is your customer in this case. So you shouldn't be thinking in a too general fashion with these things. Think about your specific experiences. It's impossible not to have had a customer, even if you wouldn't talk about your PhD. Just think about your project more thoroughly, and I'm sure you're going to find out. Coming up with situations, it's usually tells me that you don't have the right emphasis. You don't, if I may call it so, you don't dive deep enough into the details of your experience to find specific stories. So you might even be susceptible to talk a lot about hypothetical situations when compared to specific ones. So try to think of specific situations, more specific than they are right now. Is it okay to describe the same situation for different types of questions, but for each question show the situation from a different angle? Yeah, sure. So people do this all the time. Just ensure that when referencing the situation the first time, you won't talk about the overall thing. I mean, you could talk about, hey, we work on this 2-year project. That's fine. But don't call it by name. We work on project X for 2 years. Because if you do so, then in the second one, you will be automatically inclined to say, hey, while working on project X, we did another thing. Just try it. Yeah, the wording is everything there. And from experience, wording takes a bit of time with these things, but yes, it's a good idea. When asked about AWS product offerings, how much depth should I cover in the phone interview, basic or immediate level. To be honest, I have no idea. But I would expect, I mean, usually the questions at Amazon are quite deep, so I would expect them to deep probe you on these things. So expect to get many questions about metrics and to deep probe your expertise with these things. Do you know what is the interview process for a software development engineer? I have had a technical online assessment, 2 45-minute questions I completed, and 3 days later I've been asked to attend telephone interview with hiring manager about the 14 principle. The HR person organizing the interview can't tell me that the interview next week is ready, the assessment I did. Well, that's definitely something you must follow up with them, because they should know this sooner rather than later. So in either case, I think you could start looking at the 14 leadership principles. So you could start preparing if you wanted to, because either now or later they will get tested. Can we be genuine with an answer? Yes. Yes, it happens that you can be too genuine with an answer. Such as, for example, when you're asked to talk about the time when you found a solution to a difficult problem, and you found a solution to a difficult problem, but in spite of that, the project went bust. Right? So in fact, you're asked about a solution to a difficult problem, which you successfully found, but then because of over honesty, or because you don't know how to sell yourself, basically, you don't know how to sell yourself on your strengths, you would basically talk about the negative side, which would basically have nothing to do with the actual story. So this is one example of being too genuine, if you wanted to. So in these cases, basically there are two types of questions. There are positive ones and negative ones. Negative ones are the failure story, and positive ones are the rest. When it's a positive one, it should always end on a positive example, on a success. On a negative one, you should talk about the negative one, but you shouldn't end it on a negative note. So this is about being too genuine. Yeah, so it is a feasible one. Will this video be recorded and I can replay later? I think so. Yes, I don't think I have any reason not to play it later, but if I spot something dangerous here, I'm probably not. Yeah, but yes, I will make it publicly available. So Anthony, I just answered this in the beginning of this session. What's the difference between behavioral and competency-based questions? Basically, there's not much of a difference. They're both tell me about the time when. One would be the behavioral one, the strictly behavioral ones would be to test you for culture fit, and the competency-based one would be to test you for competencies. And I also gave some example. As you can see, I Googled it as well. So the behavioral ones could be give you an example of a time when you didn't meet a goal and how did you handle this. So this is the strictly behavioral one. And the competency-based interview, which is still behavioral, I must emphasize. Tell me about the time when you supported a colleague who was struggling with an area of work. So this is a competence. So in this last example, the competency they're looking for is team play. I mean, or interpersonal relationships, interpersonal skills, if you want. So the key here is to understand why they are asking you the question in the first place. I don't believe it's such a big deal, such a big difference between behavioral and competency-based questions. There is a big difference between behavioral and situational questions, because behavioral questions are tell me about the time when, and situational ones are what would you do if. And this is where it gets a bit more complicated, and especially they are probing your technical skills there. So honestly, I wasn't expecting that many questions. So I might be doing. I might do this more often because it seems like it's quite efficient at answering these things in a more organized manner. I have come through 4 rounds behavioral discussions and going for technical one now. Is not up to hands-on. Can I ask if I could be considered for management positions? So yes, you could ask them if you're going to be considered for different types of positions. However, the most common scenario that I know is that people tend to apply for different roles from the beginning. But yes, you could. For a software development engineer application, will there be technical questions in the interview or technical questions handled in the online assessment? There will be also in the interview. I would be surprised if they wouldn't ask you any technical questions in the interview. I mean, that's the main thing. Now, to what extent they will be asking you, this I cannot tell, and you should double check with them, but they will ask you technical questions, of course. Sure. For sales interview process, the best tip I know is you can easily cut your answers into half if you wanted to prepare even better. So the best answers are around 1.5 minutes, and more often than not, your answers will tend to be much longer. On the other extreme, some people tend to be too concise and to give their answers in 30 seconds, which might be a good idea, but in very isolated cases. So you would want to be around 1.5 minutes from experience. So that's the best piece of advice that I could give for a sales role in particular. So hire and develop the best. This principle will be asked only for hiring manager or for SD role too. Well, if you put it this way, only for hiring manager role. So hire and develop the best, it's asked only for management role and for roles that that require managing people. So usually no, unless it's a super. No, I assume. Sorry, I assume you're talking about Amazon here. So I wouldn't expect this. I mean, of course you're talking about Amazon, but you're talking about an individual contributor role rather than a management role. So yeah. All right, so looks like I covered everything. Actually quite happy. Wasn't expecting this many questions, as I said before. So I believe 45 minutes is a right amount of time for doing these. So, I mean, so long as there are, of course, questions. So if anyone else has any other questions, please do let me know. I will be on site to interview for a technical role. I expect behavioral questions, but will those be related to a specific project on my CV? Of course. Tell me about any. I mean, basically, your CV should contain all your past experience, or at least the main highlights of your past experience. So a behavioral question asks for a situation in the past. So yes, and if your question is whether if they're going to laser focus on a project on your CV, yes, they could. They definitely could, and I found this to be quite a common trend in some cases for the phone interviews. The other thing you want to keep in mind here is that you might want, I mean, more often than not, they will ask you, tell me about yourself, or an introductory question. And in tell me about yourself, you basically give them information from your CV, but you don't want to make it sound boring. That is to read your experiences from your CV, but you want to talk about your core strength and the main highlights from your CV. And this is one way you could lead them. You could lead the conversation, and it could be a starting point of a conversation with behavioral questions on the project that you like the best. So I would assume you asked this question because you had some projects you wouldn't necessarily want to talk about. So by focusing on the main highlights from your CV, you could basically drive the conversation your way if you wanted to. Yeah, such as, for example, how did you collaborate with your teammate on project? Or behavioral questions are more general, and project-specific questions will be more tech-related. No, so that that there's actually a link between behavioral and technical questions. A behavioral question, tell me about the most successful project, and a follow-up question, okay, how big was this project? What was the main challenge in that project, and what are the main technologies being used? Why did you use this technology? So a behavioral question could easily turn into a technical one. So think about the overall interviewing experience here, not just in terms of behavioral and technical. It's a blend between the two. And here, the best thing you could do is to, I mean, besides preparing the question themselves, is to prepare these highlights from your career, these projects, these main projects that you want to use there, in as much detail as you can, with as many metrics as you can. People often tell me that they are surprised about the level of detail that they get into in these interviews, especially for the phone interviews, because then from the onsite people come more prepared. But be prepared to take deep dives into these things. So if I can explain more about the I write a lot principle. Well, one question that's for I write a lot is tell me about the time when you failed, or which could be self-explanatory, is one of the more complicated ones. But basically, I write a lot, and I'll have to open the document here because I wanted to check something. So the definition is leaders are right a lot. They have strong judgment and good instincts. They seek diverse perspectives and work to discomfort their beliefs. So this is the behavior that you're interested in here. And you see, it's often that you showcase these things through your failures. And they're basically interested in your ability to analyze things. Like you see, usually the qualitative and the quantitative aspects of these things, on how you went above and beyond to get help using external sources, for instance, or other means. And yeah, basically they're also probing here that on the failure stories you're focusing on the learnings as well. So these would be some examples here. Now, frugality is about getting things done with limited resources. And for example, like tell me about time when you complete the project with a limited amount of resources. Of course, you should emphasize how you were frugal about these things, but some common misconceptions here. Some people, some things that people forget here is, I mean, they only optimize something. If you're talking about an under-resourced project, you only talk about we didn't have enough people, but you are not necessarily focusing on how you try to fix that also by maybe using more technology, or how you focused on maybe optimizing other parts and maybe got rid of other wasteful behaviors on things. So try to keep a positive attitude within frugality, and don't be afraid to talk about the money when it's appropriate, because frugality, it is about these things. So these would be the main things about these two principles. I've applied for a remote position. Will I be required to do an on-site interview if successful in the telephone interview? Yeah, there are two options. I mean, of course, there's always an on-site interview, but the on-site interview could be literally on-site, or there could be through video link via Amazon Chime. So I found people to be pretty disappointed when it's only online. But this being said, I've seen quite good success also with these online on-site interviews. So in any case, there is on-site interview. There's always an on-site interview. Do we need to specify these principal names during the interview? No. So what's most important here is to talk about the behavior exhibited in the principle. Basically, make it sound good to you in the first place. And truth be said, for the on-site and for more senior roles, you'll notice that there are some questions that touch upon different, multiple leadership principles. The key here is to understand why they ask you this question in the first place. And if you read those principles a couple of times, you will remember automatically to use wording from them. I would prefer not to have to travel overseas for an on-site interview because I'm a single parent, and yeah. Well, to my knowledge, that's not very much up to you, because the way they set up these interviews, they must be the same way for everyone. So that's a very important criteria in a behavioral interview. So you likely cannot control this. So I'm not sure whether there's much you can do about this, other than to try to find out in time whether if it will be possible for you to go this way, or otherwise to basically explain them what's going on, and maybe they have other processes that could be handled via remote video. Oh, they do. Okay. So I didn't know they do the option for virtual session for international candidates, to be honest with you. So the best way to understand about frugality is to read the principle and try to find out some questions. Let me give you some examples for frugality. So tell me about the time when you saved money on a project that you worked on. Can you think of a specific situation, a star answer about this one? Or how do you make trade-offs between quality and costs? These would be two examples of questions when it comes to frugality. Or tell me about the time when you requested additional resources to a project. So try to answer these questions, keeping in mind the description of the principle, and of course with numbers, with quantifiers, and with basically all the advice that I gave a couple of minutes ago. It's not one of the hardest principles, to be honest with you. Okay, guys, so thank you very much for your questions. I think this first live session was a success. So it's definitely something that I'm planning to do more often. Again, thank you very much for tuning in. And I guess I'll see you next time.